palestrantes.
Orava.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are very happy and honored in receiving here the opportunity of launching this such important book and so new, with many of its theses, and it has a very important content. And who wrote this content, in my humble opinion, should be the two main lights of this event, and what this book says and why this book says so, and why now and how. We will start from the beginning. On behalf of the São Paulo Jewish community and Contexto Publishing House, it is a pleasure to welcome everyone who is with us today this afternoon. I'd like to thank the organizer of this event. It's an initiative, personal initiative of our President Mario Fleck. And on his behalf, we thank all the team from TIP and all the team of volunteers and the upkeepers and all the members of the congregation. We would like to thank André Lajst on his behalf of all the team of Serlita for its excellent initiative, and Daniel Pinsky, whom we thank, all the people from Contexto Publishing House, this book that has been translated into Portuguese. We also thank the simultaneous translation team, Anna Kleinberger, and the Libras interpreters. The original audio is being transmitted only at TIP channels. The event in Portuguese is being transmitted of the three organizations. There is a QR code for the website of Contexto Publishing House that offers till October 3rd, 30% discount on the purchase of the book. So you can get into the link. The description still has a form that you can play with no cost. This event is part of the strategy of the SIP Academy of Jewish Studies, and we are going on, and very soon we'll have launching, a large launching. And the main proposal is to create a bridge of the new things that happen in the labs of the experts, be them journalists, from the academia, writers, artists, and the public. Everything that has to do with the Jewish interest, with themes of Jewish interest. This book, as I mentioned to you, has a very important thesis and a novelty in how to see the solution it proposes. And this is the biggest contribution. It is worthwhile reading the book. And this is why we have the honor of having one of its authors, Einat Wilf, together with Adi Schwartz, both very well-known journalists of international renown. And the book is being published now. So from André, I heard, we'll hear something about Einat's career. Be all very much welcome. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you very much, Ruben, for your words. I thank also Mario Fleck, besides being chairman of the São Paulo Jewish congregation, and the initiative of translating the book has our participation as well. And I would like also to thank the volunteers and the professionals of SIP, Contexto Publishing House, and all professionals who are working to have this book published. The theme or the theme about the return of the refugees is part of the academia, where we study the Jewish-Palestinian conflict, and one of the four pillars of what we believe to be the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians. What the book brings us is that the theme of the refugees is not just one of the four themes, but is the most important theme. It is one of the main themes that existed until then. There has been denials of accepting Israel in some moments of history, and this is why nothing better than Einat and Adi. Adi, unfortunately, he is at a place with an internet that doesn't have a good reception, so we'll have Einat. Einat is doctor in political science by the University of Cambridge, was member of the Israeli parliament between 2010-2013 by Labour Party, and published other 6 books about the central themes of the Israeli society. And now I will give the floor to Einat to introduce her work and the theme that had her to write this wonderful book. And I recommend you to buy this book. It's extremely interesting. Einat, welcome, and please tell us something about introduction of your book and this theme that is so important to us.
Thank you so much.
Sem mais delongas, eu vou deixar aqui a Einat introduzir sua obra e o tema que a levou a escrever essa obra fantástica. Recomendo a todos vocês que comprem o livro. O livro é uma delícia de ler. Ela tem uma escrita leve, tranquila, viciante e extremamente interessante. Einat, bem-vinda, por favor.
Einat, welcome.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Sorry, I'm just hearing another voice in the background. So thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you for so kindly bringing the book to the Portuguese-speaking world. I sincerely hope to be able to come in person soon enough to Brazil and to speak to you directly about the book. So generally, when people speak about the Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the things you hear about that matter to the conflict are issues about territory and settlements and occupation and Jerusalem. And we are told that those are the key issues that are needed to resolve or understand in order to know what the conflict is about. You rarely hear about the issue of the refugees, the Palestinian refugees, their demand for what they call the right of return. And if you do hear about it, it's generally presented as something not very important. What we make, Adi and I, the case that we make in the book, is not only is this the most important issue, is that this is the issue that once you understand it, you understand the conflict. You understand what the conflict is about, and you understand what is required in order to resolve it and bring about peace. And of course, the way that we got to it is that we were also, both Adi and Adi used to work at Haaretz, and I worked with peacemakers such as Yossi Beilin and Shimon Peres. I was a member of the Labour Party. I worked with Ehud Barak. I was always a supporter of a two-state solution to the conflict, Israel and Palestine, opposing settlements, wanting to end the occupation. And I supported all Israeli governments that made an effort, such as Rabin's government in the 90s, and later Ehud Barak's government in 2000. And like many Israelis of the left who supported a two-state solution, we realized a very interesting phenomenon. Despite what we were told, that the Palestinians want to end the conflict by establishing a state in the West Bank and Gaza with a capital in East Jerusalem, Whenever they faced the opportunity to do so, most prominently in 2000, but also in 2008, they didn't take it. And this didn't make sense to us. If a people want a state, why do they not say yes when they can have a state? And during that time, I had a lot of meetings with young Palestinians. If you recall, not only did the Palestinians walk away from the opportunity to have a state and to make peace, what followed was terrible violence, the blowing up of buses all across Israel, people in cafes were massacred, entire families, children, and people began to ask, if the Palestinians don't want a state in the West Bank and Gaza, what do they want? Because they could have had that, they didn't take it, so what do they want? A very simple question. And in speaking with Palestinians, I listened to them and I realized that the answer was staring us in the face all along. What they wanted, what they still want, is what they always say they want. From the river, the Jordan River, to the sea, to the Mediterranean Sea. They want all of it. They want the whole territory from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, including the state of Israel. They don't want a state, a Palestinian state next to the state of Israel. They want a Palestinian state instead of the state of Israel. And the way that this dream, this demand, this goal is manifested is in what the Palestinians call the right of return, which, as we show in the book, is neither a right nor a return. The Palestinians claim that millions of Palestinians, the lowest number is 5.5 million, normally they even say 7 or 8 million, they claim that millions of Palestinians have the right, which they don't, but they believe that they have the right to settle inside Israel, not in the West Bank and Gaza, inside Israel in the name of what they call return. Now, the numbers are such that if the millions of Palestinians exercise this so-called right, Israel becomes an Arab Palestinian state with a Jewish minority. So when Palestinian leaders, such as Abu Mazen, say that they want peace, that they want a two-state solution, the two-state solution that they envision is one Arab Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and another Arab Palestinian state to replace Israel. Until today, there has not been any Palestinian leader, and not even any Palestinian journalist, who clearly believed in a peace based on two states, one Arab, one Jewish. The idea that they will share the land with a state where one of the states is the sovereign state of the Jewish people, till today, remains unacceptable to the Palestinians, and their demand to return reflects it. The problem with the West, of course, and much of the world, is much of the world thinks the Palestinians are not serious about it. What we show in the book is that they are very serious about it. They are so serious that it is more important to them than having a state. So the priorities of the Palestinian people is from the river to the sea. The priority is return. If they can have a Palestinian state in part of the land, but it means forgoing return, it means that they have to finally accept that the other part of the land will belong to the Jewish people. This is not what they want. So I will end this opening just by saying I am a great admirer of Israel's former foreign minister and great ambassador to the United Nations, US, Abba Eban. He famously said that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. But I've come to realize, working on the book, is that they never missed an opportunity, because what we think of as opportunities, they don't consider opportunities. Establishing a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza without settlements, with a capital in East Jerusalem, that's not an opportunity. It's not what they want. So as far as they're concerned, they never missed an opportunity, because what they're fighting for, which is from the river to the sea, is the thing that they're trying to achieve. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Einat, por essa abertura fortíssima.
Einat, thank you very much for this strong opening. And you're telling us in a few words that there is no parallel thinking of the Israelis and the Palestinians. Let's think about history before all of that. Let's say the people who are not experts in the conflict believe in the majority that these are two people, and each people has its narrative, and each one believes that they have the right to the land. Within the people, we have a mixed base that will say, I want everything. And the more pragmatic one, I want everything, but I will assign a part, because the other one also wants everything. But we're seeing that, in fact, during a long time, many people saw people said, when they opened the Tanakh, they said, oh, this land was ours. So there was no Syria nor Jordan, and everything was Israel. And when the partition came, Jews from the right, they celebrate the partition of Palestine in 1947. The Palestinians did not celebrate it. And I'm saying that this posture of I want everything, and this is why I don't celebrate anything, it perpetrates in all of us. There is no Palestinian left pragmatic saying, I want everything. So you have to be pragmatic. You have to accept part of it.
Okay, so you're absolutely right that the solution is simple. We have two peoples on the land, the Jewish people, the Arab Palestinians. They both have a connection to the land, each from their own perspective. Neither one can have all of it, and therefore each side will have some of it. This was the logic behind all the peace agreements. This was the logic, as you mentioned, behind the United Nations Partition Plan of 1947. So you're right that this is the governing idea of how to resolve the conflict, and this is very much what I would like to see one day. But here is where we have a division in terms of the symmetry. From the Arab-Palestinian perspective, the Jewish claim to the land is illegitimate in any borders, not even a little bit. As far as they're concerned, the Jews are foreigners. They call us colonialists, they call us crusaders, they compared us recently to the Americans in Afghanistan. As far as they're concerned, we are foreigners. And because we're foreigners, we're also temporary, which means with enough time, we will disappear, just like the British, just like the French in Algeria, just like the Americans in Afghanistan, and of course, just like the Crusaders. So as far as they're concerned, their overall mission is to throw out the invading foreigners. They do not accept any notion that the Jews have a historic connection to the land. This is why you see them promoting in the UN and other bodies the idea that the Jews have no connection to the land, no connection to Jerusalem. The Jews, from the beginning, recognized that there are Arabs living there. Ever since the conquest of the Arab world of the Middle East in the 7th century, the people who live in the land have become Arabs and Muslims. The Jews recognized it, which is why from the beginning, the Jews supported ideas of partition. Initially, the partition with Jordan, later the partition of 1947, because as much as the Jews recognize that they have a connection to all of the land, they have connection to land which is now in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Egypt. But the Jews, and especially the Zionist movement, has always been very pragmatic, saying, look, we would love to have all of it, but we understand that there are other people here, so let's share. So the Zionist movement has always been willing to share, not because it was happy about it, just because it was pragmatic. The Arab side, and especially the Arab Palestinian side, was never willing to share, because in their perspective, the Jews are foreigners who should go, not people with whom you share. They're people that you should push out, not people that you should live with and divide the land. So this is why there's no symmetry. Yes, on the Israeli side, you are right. There are people who want all of it. But at the end of the day, they are a tiny, tiny minority. The number of Israeli Jews who, if tomorrow there's a Palestinian leader and people who will come to the Jewish people in Israel and will say, look, we're done. The conflict is over. We understand that you too have a historical connection to this land. We recognize it, we accept it, but you can't have all of it. We can't have all of it. We're not going to demand return. You cannot settle everywhere that was mentioned in the Bible. Let's figure out how we divide the land between the two of us. If a Palestinian leader and people will say that to the Israeli Jews, the number of Israeli Jews who will say, absolutely not, we don't care, we should still control all of the West Bank, is minuscule, and they will be easily overturned by the vast majority of Israelis who always care far more about having a state for the Jews than in controlling each and every square centimeter that was ever mentioned in the Bible. And this is what is needed to end the conflict. The conflict basically ends very simply in one of two ways. One way is the Arab-Palestinian vision. The Jews leave. If the Jews leave or the Jews agree to be a religious minority in an Arab state, the conflict ends from the Arab-Palestinian perspective. The other way that the conflict ends, which is my preference, is that the Arab, and especially the Arab Palestinians, finally accept that the Jewish people have a legitimate right to self-determination in part of the land, and they open negotiations with us on how to divide the land, and they stop trying to control all of it.
Perfect, Einat. Within this context, I would like to bring two perspectives of thought, and I would like you to make some comments about it. The first of them is in the documentary Oslo, and there is a book called Oslo that speaks about what happened behind the talks in Oslo that started as unofficial and then became official. I remember that they speak, Shimon Peres is negotiating and said, I want you to acknowledge the legitimacy of the state of Israel and not only the existence of Israel. And Arafat denies at that moment to recognize the legitimacy of the state of Israel. He only recognized the existence of Israel. And this is a very interesting shading of the word, because it has to be with the legitimacy of political aspirations of the Jewish people, which is what makes me ask you, would this be a problem of conceptual order more than a problem of practical order? Can we state that the rejection towards Israel is a conceptual issue?
It actually, this is the issue itself. There's no way to play with it. If you look at the various ways that Palestinian leaders have tried to go around it, and we talk about it in the book, they will talk about the legitimacy of Israel, they will talk about the existence of Israel, they will talk about a two-state solution, but where will they stop? At anything that talks about the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. Because, for example, when they say, okay, Israel is legitimate or we support a two-state solution, and they still demand what they call the right of return, then they're not recognizing the right of the Jewish people to self-government. They're basically saying, yeah, we want a state for ourselves, and your state is legitimate, but we want to make it an Arab state. So that's not really what the Jewish side envisions. The Jewish side wants to live in a state where ultimately we govern ourselves. That's the purpose. If we don't have that, then we're not interested. The whole idea of Israel was to be the one state in the world where the Jewish people have self-governance. It's not only for the Jewish people, but it definitely has to be a state that is by and for the Jewish people. And this is something that the Palestinians fundamentally still reject. They reject every part of it. They reject the idea that the Jewish people are a people. You will often hear Palestinian leaders say things like, we respect those of the Jewish faith. We have nothing against religious Jews. So this is a conception that says, as long as Jews agree to think of their Jewish identity as a religion, that's not a problem because they can be a Jewish religious minority in an Arab country. That's fine. So they always make the point of differentiating between Judaism as a faith or a religion and Judaism as a people and a nation. They completely reject the idea that the Jews are a people and a nation. You will hear it again and again. They reject the idea that the Jewish people have any connection whatsoever to the land of Israel. The Jews are presented as complete and utter foreigners, colonialists who came to a land to which they have no connection. So if the Jews are not a people and they're not a nation, they don't have the right to govern themselves, like the Slovaks or Slovenians, for that matter. And if they don't have a connection to the land of Israel, then they certainly do not have the right to govern themselves in that land. This is the fundamental issue. It's not just a matter of language. It's not a matter of finding a way for them to say it. When they say it, the day they will say it is also the day they will mean it, which is why you mentioned Shimon Peres. I worked for him for a few years. Shimon Peres was known for his notion of constructive ambiguity, which means if we want to make peace, let's not say things clearly. Let's make things ambiguous. But what we discovered is that this ambiguity has been destructive, not constructive, because each side understood it differently. Israelis thought that there was peace, and Palestinians continued to believe in the right of return and from the river to the sea. So I've become the exact opposite in terms of my vision for peace. We need constructive specificity. Things need to be said clearly and specifically. And what needs to be said clearly, more than anything, by the Palestinian people and leadership is, we recognize the right of the Jewish people as a people and a nation to self-determination in the land of Israel. We recognize a right, it's a legitimate right. We have a right to self-determination too. And therefore, let's see how we divide the land so that both peoples can live side by side. The day that we will hear that Palestinian leadership is the day we will have peace.
Ou seja, Einat, você e o livro diz.
And the book says it in several parts, and I believe and I agree with André. The book is very nicely and it's easy to read. So you are telling us that practical, political ideas of territories won't work unless the conceptual side is resolved. This is the first part of the question. If this is the point, what is the way? Because you are an expert in international policy, and here is speaking the philosopher of the dialogue, the rabbi. It seems to me that you are speaking in education. You're speaking about philosophy and not politics. How can you change if this is the problem of
povo concebe outro povo? É como humano.
How a country conceives as a country and conceives the existence of another people. We are in my territory. I'm a rabbi and not in yours. I've studied philosophy and education. And we speak how someone defines through the definition of other people. But this is an intellectual process. Is this what you propose?
So, yes, you're absolutely right that in terms of what is needed to bring peace is nothing less than the transformation of Palestinian identity or the Palestinian ethos. From the beginning, the Palestinian identity and the Palestinian ethos was very much connected to the battle against the invading foreigners. This is who they are. They are the people who are fighting against the invading foreigners. Now they need a different identity, which says we will build our own state next to the Jewish people. That's a very different identity. That's a very different goal. Now, you're right that people do not change who they are easily. It's not something that will happen tomorrow morning. It's not that they will read my book and say, oh, yes, she's right. We recognize the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. The only way for the Palestinians to get to that point is if basically all the other options will be closed to them. And this is really what the book is intended to achieve. For many decades, the Arab world gave the Palestinians a blank check. Because if the conflict had really been an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, just between the Jews and Arabs of the land, that conflict was over in April 1948. In April 1948, the war between Jews and Arabs in the land was over. The battle lines were pretty much established. That would have been over. It became an Arab-Israeli conflict when 5 Arab armies invaded to continue the war, making it the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, for decades, the Arab world gave the Palestinians a blank check to say no. The only reason the Palestinians could continue to say no for so many decades is that they had the Arab world and the Islamic world, and of course the Soviet and non-aligned world for a long time behind them. This is changing. We are now beginning to have parts of the Arab world which are saying to the Palestinians, enough. You are no longer going to have a blank check to keep saying no, no, and no. The problem is that we have countries in the West, countries that are funding UNRWA, the organization that essentially perpetuates for millions of Palestinians the idea that Israel will one day disappear and that they will have Palestine from the river to the sea. So for more than 70 years, Western countries like the United States, Europe, Australia are giving more than $1 billion to an organization that is telling the Palestinians generation after generation, keep believing, keep fighting, one day Israel will disappear and you will have Palestine from the river to the sea. This is crazy. And that's what the book is intended to achieve. The book is saying to the West, you are indulging the Palestinians in a dream that all of the land will one day be theirs. How can you ever expect the Palestinians to say yes to any peace agreement that is based on partition if you're constantly sustaining them in the belief that they will one day have all of it? So one of the examples we show in the book is with the German refugees after World War II. After World War II, there were 14 million German refugees. The war is already over. Germany signed an unconditional surrender. And yet, 14 million Germans are being pushed into carts. These were some very brutal scenes that we include in the book. And they're sent from Czechoslovakia and from Poland into the new borders of Germany. Now, they want their old houses back, of course. Every refugee wants. But does anyone indulge them? Does anyone have an organization for them for 70 years that says, yes, one day you will get your house in the Sudeten, one day you will get your house in Poland? No. We show in the book that throughout the 20th century, there were tens of millions of refugees in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. They are not sustained by organizations to keep dreaming of their old homes generation after generation. They built new lives wherever they were. Yes, it was tragic. War is tragic. But the message for tens of millions of refugees around the world was move on. Move on. The war is over. You're not getting your old house back. Build a new future. And as a result, we have peace in Europe. We have far fewer wars. But with Palestinians, for some reason, the world was willing to indulge them rather than give them the message that all refugees in the world got, which is the war is over, you lost your home, move on, build a new life wherever you are. They were indulged in the message that said, no, wait, one day the war will be undone and you will go back to the era before these foreign invaders were here. So how could you expect there to be peace when the West that claims to want peace, that claims to want a two-state solution, is constantly indulging the Palestinians in this dream of from the river to the sea? So our message is this: stop indulging them, send them the very difficult message that was given to all other refugees in the 20th and the 21st century, which is the war is over. That's it. The war is over and it's done. Wherever you are now is wherever you're going to build your future. You're citizens of Jordan. You will remain citizens of Jordan. You live in the West Bank and Gaza. You will continue to live there. And focus on building your future where you are, rather than hoping to take back another people's country. When this process will begin, it might still take another generation. For Germany, it took 24 years until Willy Brandt made peace with Poland and told the German refugees that they will never get this land back. So it took 24 years after they were told that the war is over. it might still take a generation, but we didn't even begin this process. And this is what the book hopes to achieve, to at least start this process of the transformation of the Palestinian identity away from trying to destroy Israel and towards trying to live next to Israel.
Einat, eu queria te trazer para pensamento.
Einat, I want to bring in a thought so that you can help our audience to understand the difference between the UN agencies for refugees. We know that there are two agencies: United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. In Portuguese, the acronym is ACNUR, and the UNRWA for the Palestinians. So I would like to mention a few details in my question so that we can reflect together. First, the status. You have a different status for refugees of UNCH, like the Syrians, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and now Afghanistan, that come to Brazil and get the citizenship or permanent residence. They are no longer refugees according to the UNCH. And according to the UNRWA, those who went to France, Argentina, United States in 48, 49, obviously got their citizenship, but they are still refugees. And their children who were born in those new countries are also refugees, and their grandchildren are refugees. So it's an absurd situation. Someone who went from the region of Palestine to the US in 49 and got married and had children, and he can run for the presidency of the US because he was born in the US, he's still considered a refugee. There is a contradiction there. At the same time, we have Palestinian refugees in Lebanon who live in refugee camps with walls and rules that look more like an apartheid of South Africa, refugees in Syria, and refugees inside the Gaza Strip and the West Bank that are territories that they control. So I would like to bring this imbroglio to you, this salad, so that maybe you can describe why what did the world want to do? Why did they want to have an organization for Palestinians only? And how does this hinder the situation? And at the same time, to bring the reality of those refugees who live in Lebanon, Syria, and the territories that are controlled by Palestinians.
So I'll be happy to do it, because really by comparing, like you did, the real refugees of the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees to the mostly non-refugees of UNRWA, we can understand the absurdity and why it's a main obstacle to peace. So generally, as a broad stroke, you can argue that the entire 20th century is basically about one political transition from empire to nation state. This transition involved 2 world wars, many bloody civil wars and other wars, but we begin the 20th century with much of the world divided between empires, and we end the 20th century when much of the world is divided between nation states. In the process of these wars, the establishment of new states, the creation of borders, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people became refugees. Before World War II, there was no special anything that dealt with it. You had Greeks and Turks who were pushed away very brutally in population exchanges and in many other situations. But after World War II, when there were refugees all across Europe, in Asia, in the subcontinent, between India and Pakistan, in East Asia. Basically, the United Nations newly created a treaty for refugees, defining what a refugee is, basically a person who is persecuted in their home country. They have to be a citizen of that country and be persecuted in their country, and then they run away and they're a refugee, meaning they get the protection of other countries. And as soon as they become a citizen of another country, they're no longer refugees. End of story. And the purpose of the UNHCR is really to bring an end to the unprotected status of refugees, find them protection, mostly for citizenship, and thereby they end their status as refugees. It's a very efficient agency. It has settled tens of millions of refugees in the last 70 years of its existence. UNRWA was created at about the same time to deal with the Arab refugees from the war between the Arabs and the Jews over the future of Israel and the Palestinian state. Initially, UNRWA was not a bad organization. It was trying to settle most of the Arab refugees, we need to know, settled in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in Jordan. That's almost 80%. Jordan, which annexed the West Bank, actually gave them citizenship because Jordan really wanted to end the war with Israel, but then the Palestinian assassinated King Abdallah, and that kind of put an end to that. Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip, but that's it. Most of the refugees were actually in the West Bank, Gaza, and citizens of Jordan, including in the West Bank. Now, that meant they're not really refugees, but and the US and the UK gave a lot of money to UNRWA to help settle those refugees. But the refugees did not want to be settled. What we show in the book is that there's this mythology that the Palestinian refugees have been manipulated by bigger forces. But the truth is that they themselves refused to be resettled, because they knew that as soon as they would be resettled, the war is over. And we bring a lot of research and quotes in the book showing that Palestinians themselves in the 50s refused to be resettled because they refused to accept that the war was over. And they knew that if they would be resettled, the war was over. So basically, the US and the UK want to close down UNRWA. They realize that UNRWA is unable to resettle anyone. In the book, we bring, I think, a great example of another organization called UNCRA for Korea, for the refugees of Korea. UNCRA and UNRWA were meant to be temporary organizations, settle the refugees, and close down. UNCRA did that. UNCRA settled 2 million Korean refugees. The war is at the same time in the early 50s. That's 3 times the number of the Palestinians. They do it for much less than the money that is given to UNRWA. And look at where South Korea is today. It could have been the Palestinians. Imagine if South Korea still had camps on the border with the North. I mean, South Korea is a thriving, rich country because people moved on. So UNCRA closed down, achieved its goal. UNRWA didn't close down. Why? It didn't achieve its goal, and yet the Arab countries, which at this point were very important, they had oil was important, they controlled waterways for oil. The Arab countries basically threatened America and the UK to say, you will not close down UNRWA. You made the mistake of supporting partition, the US, but you're not going to make the mistake of closing down UNRWA. UNRWA was clearly understood by the Arab world as a way of keeping the war open. So UNRWA remained open, and UNRWA and the Arab countries made sure that UNRWA was not part of the UNHCR. And they basically created a loophole where UNRWA is its own world. So it has its own definition for a refugee, which has nothing to do with persecution, has nothing to do with citizenship. It's just about people who lived for 2 years, just 2 years, in the area between the river and the sea and lost their homes. That's not the normal definition of a refugee. What UNRWA does and UNHCR does not do is it transfers the refugee, like you mentioned, generation after generation. It does never end the refugee status. So if someone left Jordan or Lebanon or Syria, a Palestinian, and they became an American citizen or a Brazilian citizen, UNRWA still keeps them on their books as a refugee, which is insane. UNRWA never takes anyone off the books. UNHCR, as soon as someone gets citizenship, they're happy to take that person off their books. It means they were successful. UNRWA never takes anyone off their books, even if they have citizenship, even if they became millionaires, they're still a refugee on UNRWA books. And this is how we have today on UNRWA's books 5.5 million people who are registered as Palestinian refugees. The Palestinians claim 7 million because they even talk about children who live in Canada or Brazil, whom UNRWA doesn't count anymore. And just to understand how absurd it is, 2.2 million, 40% live in Jordan. They're citizens of Jordan. They were never displaced by war. They don't live in refugee camps. Many of them are middle class. Some of them are wealthy business people, and they're still listed as refugees. By any international or practical definition, they're not refugees. Another 40%, another 2.2 million live in the West Bank and Gaza. So even by their definition, they live in Palestine. Most of them are the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. They've never been displaced by war. Most of them don't even live in refugee camps. The camps by now have become neighborhoods. So you have a 30-year-old middle-class lawyer living in Ramallah who's listed as a refugee from Palestine, but he lives in Palestine. It's an insane absurdity. And then you have another million who are registered in Syria and Lebanon, but we know from recent data that most of them left. Most of them left Lebanon, most of them left Syria because of the conditions you mentioned. They became citizens of Germany, they work in Dubai. I'm sure some of them are Brazilian citizens. They're still on the books as if they're refugees. So the amazing thing is that the actual Palestinian refugee problem is very small. There are very, very few Palestinians who, by international standards, are refugees. Maybe 100,000, maybe 200,000. Those are small numbers that could easily be settled or resettled. That's not a big deal. But the refugee problem is a symbolic issue. It's actually not a practical issue. Practically, it's not an important issue. But symbolically, it's the most important issue. For Palestinians, the idea that they are refugees, even when they're citizens of Jordan or living in Ramallah, is the legitimacy that the world gives to the idea that one day Palestine from the river to the sea will be theirs. We saw this recently when, under President Trump, America took its funding away from UNRWA. America for years was the #1 funder for UNRWA. They took away the money. Now, did the Palestinians say, oh no, what are we going to do without the money? We cannot pay the teachers for the UNRWA schools, or no. What they said is the American president is trying to take away our right of return. The Palestinians perceive Western support for UNRWA not as humanitarian support, which is what the West mistakenly thinks. The Palestinians perceive Western support for UNRWA as political legitimacy for their dream of Palestine from the river to the sea. And that's what we highlight in the book.
Então, de algum modo, Einat, você sugere que...
So, in a way, Einat, you suggest that it's not only a war of return, but allow me bore of recognition, of legitimacy, because all in all, if I got it well, just like the Jews had to leave the houses they had in the West Bank during the war and were resettled on the Jewish side, by the same token, those who stayed on the other side should recognize that they are in their house in the West Bank and Gaza and dedicate themselves to it. Those who were never there and are a prosperous entrepreneur in Canada and has relatives in Ramallah, just like a Jew that is prosperous in the US and with family in Jerusalem. It's not a matter of return. They are in their home. Because those who are in Ramallah and wants to return to Ramallah, they're already here. And those Jews that are in Canada, they have to call themselves for what they are and also call the others for what they are, independently of political ideologies. It's no longer clear what's left, what's right. But if this is the argument, and in our audience, I believe we have people that are more to the left, more to the right, more to the side or the other side. They can be Arabs or Israelis or Palestinians or Jews. But for me, it seems very interesting. It's not a matter of denying the rights to return. It's a matter of dividing a common space so that each and everyone can return to his or her space and accept the fact that the space is not everything, because it means war. It means to kill the other. We might also have said, this is ours, and we have to go back to all. So I am going to wage a war against Syrians and Lebanese. There are no Jews in history that said, never in history there was a Jew that said, it's all mine, we have to expel and kill everyone else. So maybe it's a matter of acknowledging the other, of giving legitimacy to the other, and to live with the idea that for the other one to exist, I have to give in some things. We have to stop thinking that the other is man's wolf. Hobsbawm said it. Freud said that for people to live in a civilized way, have to stop thinking that the other one is a threat. And we in Sukkot believe that a sukkah has to be a place of peace when everyone sits together. In Israel, we used to celebrate Sukkot to discuss those things with the Palestinians. So it's interesting to take the opportunity of Sukkot to think of it, that maybe the major contribution of your book, correct me if I'm wrong, it's about to acknowledge the right of the existence of the other. We have to acknowledge the right of the Palestinians to exist, and they have to acknowledge the right of the Jewish people to exist. And so we have to give part of our territory and understand that the other one will bring his family and his descendants, and we will thus live in peace. And maybe we will gain much more than with the continuation of this conflict. I can't hear you, Einat.
You are absolutely correct that the fundamental vision is one where Jews and Arab Palestinians each have their own political state in part of the land, understanding that they cannot have all of it. The problem is that you said, okay, the Jews need to recognize that the Palestinians have legitimate aspirations and rights to live in a state of their own. Israel has recognized it again and again and again. Beginning, of course, in partition in 1947, when Israel said yes, and the Arab Palestinians said no, all the way to the last few years, 2000, 2008, when Israel said, go, have your own state, we'll remove the settlements, you can have a capital in East Jerusalem, we'll end the occupation, have a state. But the Palestinians walked away. Why did they walk away? Because for them, and you are right, this is the core issue. For them, the priority, the bigger priority is for the Jews not to have a state rather than for themselves to have a state. In Camp David, in this 2000 proposal, the Palestinians were told, once you have your state, you can tell every Palestinian anywhere in the world to come live in your state. Just like Israel, as soon as it was established, could have its own immigration law that says any Jew can come live in Israel. So when Palestine is established, tell Palestinians anywhere in the world that they can come live here. This will be your right of return. But the Palestinians were like, that's not what we mean by the right of return. Because, as I said, 2.2 million live in the West Bank and Gaza. That's where the state of Palestine is supposed to be. And they still demand return for those people. So they're not interested in Palestinians from Syria coming to live in Ramallah. They want Israel. The right of return was never innocent. This is what we show in the book. It's not an innocent idea that says, oh, I just want my home back. It was from the beginning a political idea that basically said, we do not accept the outcome of the war. We do not accept that Israel was established, and we will spend our lives, generation after generation, trying to undo the war of 1948. That's what the idea of return is. So when you come to them and you say, you will have your own state in the West Bank and Gaza, you can let any Palestinian come live there, return to Palestine, they're saying, that's not what we mean, that's not what we want. And that's what we emphasize in the book. I even invented a word for it. I call it West-plaining, which is basically when Westerners explain what Palestinians have just said. Palestinians say, we want from the river to the sea. The right of return is inside Israel. And Westerners say, no, they just want a state in the West Bank and Gaza. No, we need to listen very carefully to what Palestinians say. They've been very consistent, very clear about what they want. And they are only going to change what they want if they have no other choice. As long as they are sustained by still some of the Arab world and the Western world in saying we want everything, they're not going to change their goals. And Westerners say, no, they just want a state in the West Bank and Gaza. No, we need to listen very
Perfeito, Einat. Eu queria te trazer.
Perfectly, Einat.
Very clear about what
Eu queria te trazer para uma.
I would like to bring you.
If they have no
André, we are having problems with the sound. Only one microphone should be open. Only the person who's speaking into the microphone. Einat, I would like to bring you about a thought about it. Some of us already, we thought about it. And I also think in our studies here that has to do with the rise in the cause. The other day, I was seeing a series, The Man in the High Castle, as if the Nazis had won the war and conquered the US, and there are people who resist the Nazis, and there were discussion among the groups who want to fight, and they said that the cause is more important than the goal. The cause becomes psychologically more important than to reach the goal of the cause for some of the Palestinian leadership, and to become a cause and have salaries and advantages for being a cause. So Abu Jihad and Mahmoud Abbas and so many others, leaders who grew in Fatah, in PLO, both as refugees or in the armed fight against Israel. I think that after the fall of Soviet Union, this transformation that they had, even with all the rejection they had, but till today we hear phrases mainly in Arabic when they speak to Arab TV. They say that Israel should not exist. They will never exist. The right of return to a new Palestine and give up the return to Israel. Is there a psychological issue in order to perpetrate the cause so that the goal of the cause will never take place because of what they want to conquer is impossible?
Nós estamos ouvindo, Einat.
Einat, tá sem som.
Let's start from the end. They don't think that their goal is impossible. I always tell people who say, oh, Palestinians know that their goal is impossible. They're not going to conquer Israel. The right of return is just a delusion. I tell them, look, open a map. That's what the Palestinians do. Open a map. What do the Palestinians see when they open a map? They see about 7 million Jews, give or take, living among 500 million Arabs, surrounded 1.5 billion Muslims. They can very reasonably and rationally believe that with enough patience, 1 generation, 50 years, 100 years, this will all be theirs. So let's begin by the fact that they don't think that their goal is impossible. It might take time, but they don't think it's impossible. It's very important to understand that. They're not delusional, they're not irrational. They actually think that the irrational side in the conflict is us, 7 million Jews who think they can survive in a 500 million Arab world or 1.5 billion Muslim world. So they're not being irrational. They think their goal is achievable. Now, in terms of the people and the leadership, sadly, is actually more moderate than the people. We want to believe in a mythology where the people just want peace, and the leadership is so corrupt that they're keeping the issue going. Actually, it's been the opposite. The leadership generally has been willing to be a little more moderate, but they can't really split with their people. And the Palestinian people are very much committed to the idea of return. And it's not an abstract idea. In recent years, we've had a lot of demonstrations and violent activity next to the Gazan border with Israel. You know, they never march on the Gazan border with Egypt, right? They always march on the Gazan border with Israel. All these marches are for one thing. What are they called? They're called the marches of return. They say that they want to use Gaza not in order to make Gaza into the Singapore of the Middle East or to make Gaza into a prosperous Dubai on the Mediterranean. They say they want to use Gaza in order to take back, in their mind, to take back Palestine from the river to the sea. The Palestinians say it very clearly, and then the rest of the world says, oh, they're doing that because of the blockade, or they're doing that because conditions in Gaza are very difficult. No, it's an attitude that doesn't treat the Palestinians seriously. Listen to them, take them seriously. They know what they're fighting for. They're willing to fight for it for another 100 years. The only way they're going to stop fighting for it is if they will lose the support of the Arab world, which is beginning to happen. So that makes me hopeful. If they lose the support of the Arab world, and they lose the support of the Western world, not support for having a state. I want them to have Arab and Western support to have a state next to Israel. But as long as they believe that they have Arab and Western support to keep fighting to destroy Israel, they will continue to dedicate their life to this idea. They will only stop when they no longer have Arab support for saying no, and they will no longer have Western support for saying no. Only then will they begin the very difficult process of coming to terms with Israel, understanding that without Arab support and without Western support, they cannot defeat Israel. That's true. And then they will finally begin to change and have more other ideas about what they want to do. But right now, they think that the idea from the river to the sea is a very rational, reasonable, and achievable goal.
Bravo.
Ok. Talvez estamos chegando ao nosso finalzinho, vamos vendo.
Entendendo que sem esse suporte árabe.
Cuidado com o canal, porque estamos ouvindo a tradução que estão passando para ela.
We are getting to the end of our talk. Einat and everyone, André, we are getting to the end of our event, and we are interspersing some of the questions of other people. There are many comments from both sides. And there are different opinions, and we are for different ideas, different values, and people who change their mind. And Einat came from the left. She worked with Shimon Peres, and based not on politics, but in studies, and these are legitimate opinions to be listened to. And it's important not to deny the return, but how is it possible that we, being Jews, after 2000, ceaselessly praying to go back to Israel, we wouldn't want the return of other people to their land? And perhaps this is important to reinforce. I understand that you have a legitimate right of the Palestinian to be what is their land, but not all of it. Because if you want all the land, you will have to kill me, and I won't renounce to my land. So they don't have right to what we have the right. So this would be interesting to be answered.
So one of the things that Palestinians really like to play on is this idea of like, the Jews got to return, why don't we? And in doing so, they completely mask the very different goal. Zionism, as the liberation movement of the Jewish people, wanted the Jewish people to have a state. To have a state where, in the one land, the one piece of land, to which they had a connection. Zionism was always focused on a very clear goal, a state for the Jewish people, which is why they made it very clear that they are willing to divide and share, because the idea of having a state for the Jewish people could be achieved in part of the land. So the land was partitioned with the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, and then in partition. And the Zionist movement always said yes, yes, and yes, because the goal was to have a state. The goal of the Zionist movement was never return. Jews could always travel and come and be buried and die in the land of Israel. The goal of Zionism was for the Jewish people to govern themselves in their land. It doesn't have to be all of it. The Palestinian idea of return was created after the War of 1948. And it's very important to emphasize, if the Palestinians said yes to partition in 1947, no one would have been moved. All they had to do was say yes. But because they waged war against the establishment of a Jewish state in any borders, the outcome of that war is that many of them became refugees, as happened in many wars. They're not special. What is different is, unlike all other refugees in the world, the Palestinians refused to accept the outcome of the war. And they created this idea of return, not as an innocent idea, but as a way to undo the war, and especially, of course, to undo the establishment of the state of Israel. So for Jews, the idea of coming to live in the land of Israel was part of the greater idea of establishing a state and self-governing. For the Palestinians, what they call return is part of their idea of undoing the Jewish state. Those are very different goals. One of the things we quote in the book, and I think it's a very powerful quote, is that the British foreign minister in 1947, Ernst Bevin, if you know anything about him, he didn't like Jews, he didn't like Zionism, but he understood the conflict. He goes to the British Parliament to explain why Britain is leaving. And he says that there is an irreconcilable conflict. He calls it irreconcilable. Why? He says there's two peoples in the land, there's Jews, there's Arabs. He says what the Jews want is a state. What the Arabs want for the Jews not to have a state. Listen to those two goals. The Jews want a state, the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. Those are irreconcilable goals by definition. And this is what the two sides have been doing ever since. This is why the Jews said yes to partition. Because partition, even though they were not happy about it, partition was without Judea, the cradle of Jewish civilizations. Partition was without Zion, without Jerusalem, and they still said yes because it served their goal of having a state. The Arabs said no to having a state and to partition because it did not serve their goal of preventing the establishment of a Jewish state. So the idea of Palestinian return is merely the new phase of saying no to the Jewish state. That's all it is. It's not an innocent idea. Now, it was mentioned that the fall of the Soviet Union changed things. Until the fall of the Soviet Union, the Palestinians, because of the backing they had from the Soviet Union, from the non-aligned movement, from the Arab world, were very clear that their goal was the destruction of Israel. They made it very clear. Beginning at the late 80s, when they no longer had the support of the Soviet Union and they wanted the support of the West, they changed their language. They started speaking about self-determination in two states, but they never, ever, never gave up on the idea that 7 million Palestinians have what they consider a sacred right to settle inside Israel. So most Westerners don't understand that when Palestinians say we support two states, but the right of return is sacred, they're not supporting two states. They're supporting the same idea they had since 100 years ago, that the Jewish people should not govern themselves in any part of the land to which they have a connection. So again, The Jews, the idea of the return of the Jews was only to establish a state in part of the land. The goal was a state. The idea of Palestinian return was established and created in order to destroy the state of the Jews. They're very, very, very different goals.
Perfeito, Einat. A gente está se aproximando do final.
Perfect, Einat. We are getting close to the end. And it's over midnight in Israel. I don't know if you are in Israel or United States now. In Israel, it's over midnight. And I wanted to make a comment and bring, I would like to thank to SIP and Rabbi Ruben Contexto Publishing House and StandWithUs and Mario Fleck. And I would like you to bring a final idea of the importance of the book, because the book is really brings open a truth that some people don't want to accept. They don't want to accept, many of them, because they are closed within parallel realities that happen to nourish their own narratives. For instance, the racist movement BDS, they place resolution 194 as being one of the demands that they have for the boycott. But resolution 194, as you mentioned in the book, is taken out of context as a supposed right to the return that United Nations don't award them. And several paragraphs speak about the establishment of agreement, peace agreements, and even the Arabs, they reject this resolution. So these data are totally ignored by people, even in the academia of the best universities of the world, in Brazil, United States, in England, and they repeat lies and fake news to put Israel in an oppressive mode. And I think that this is very important, the reflection that the book brings. So once more, I would like you to make your final remarks. And before the final remarks, I would like the rabbi to make his final remarks. And I would like to thank once again the attendance of everyone. Thank you very much. And we expect to bring you in Brazil for a round of conversation as a journalist. Your final remarks, Andreas, was the last question to André. Let's hear Einat, and then we say goodbye, everyone, together. As we are speaking about the good about the book, perhaps to put the issue is that again the right from the right and from the left, and a large part of Palestinian population agreeing or not with their own leaders, there is a fact that many of them are living in situations with very little dignity and very little rights. And we should also address it, not only us, but we should talk also about this as well. I am not speaking to the prosperous lawyer in Canada, but a poor person where the world of the West doesn't come to him and doesn't have the physical structure, sanitary structure, water, and this is also a fact. Please, Einat.
So I'll be very clear. There are many poor people around the world. There are many people living in difficult conditions. I am very much in favor of the world helping poor Palestinians, poor people. But we need to separate that from the political question. You can help people, you can give money, but what we're highlighting is that it's not about humanitarian conditions. I know that it makes us feel good to think that this is only a humanitarian issue, but talk to the Palestinians themselves. They will be very clear that what they're fighting for, even in the price of misery and poverty, is they believe they're fighting for a noble and dignified goal. We might think that it's not dignified, but they believe, truly believe, that the goal of destroying Israel and pushing Israel out is a dignified and noble goal, and they're willing to sacrifice their lives for it. One of the biggest mistakes made by the West is thinking that you can bribe people out of their convictions. If they believe that it's better for them to use cement in Gaza, to build tunnels, to fight and to take back what they believe is their land, then they will use cement to build tunnels. They will not use cement to build a home. This is their worldview. And we need to understand that until that worldview changes, this is going to be the priorities of their society. They're going to divert all their resources to fighting Israel rather than building their own future. So they must change their goals. And once they change their goals, which is going to be a difficult process, which, as I said, will not happen as long as they think they have legitimacy for their current goal. Once they change their goals, they will be able to divert all their resources to building a state, which will be prosperous. They will find that everyone wants to help them. If you look at it, at the end of the day, the world has been sympathetic to Palestinians for decades, but they have not been able to use the sympathy, including that of BDS, to achieve anything, because what they've been trying to achieve is for there to be no Israel. The day they will change their goal to building a Palestinian state next to Israel rather than instead of it, all the money, all the support, all the sympathy they have will manifest itself in creating a good country. As long as their priority is no Israel, that's what they're going to use their resources for.
Obrigado, Einat. Obrigado, obrigado. Eu me despeço.
Thank you, Einat. I say goodbye. I only can thank Einat for this presentation and her motives, and speak about the book, the partnership of Stand With Us and the publishing house, to thank the translators in English, Portuguese, and sign language translators, and tell once again that we are interested in having Sukkot. The Sukkah is a place where different people get together, and the four species represent the diversity that should live together and should accept that one has one color, another form, and different flavor, and the fourth give shade. But there are many differences with many strong and many weak points, and it's living together in the exchange of ideas and the exchange of values that we will be able all to live in this huge village that is the world, in this limited space of the Middle East, and even more limited, which is the land of Israel. And the first thing that we need to recognize is that there is another one, and another one has the right to exist. And he has to know that also I have the right to exist. And this is what we are talking, and we will give many ideas and means of read and discuss. And for this, the academia will turn itself. Thank you very much. Let's enlarge our discussion, study philosophy, politics, art, and let's enlarge our spirit. Hag Sameach for everyone. Thank you very much once again. Nice evening. Thank you, Einat, Toda Rabba. Thank you, everyone who attended. Thank you very much.